Good evening. Thanks so much for coming out this evening. We're really excited to see you. Thanks for being here for the first event in our Embattled Lawrence series. The next one will be October 30th, and it will be about our sewers ourselves. I'm looking forward to that one. I'm Melissa Fisher-Isaacs. I'm the Information Services Supervisor here at the library, and I'm excited to welcome Dennis Domer for a deep dive into some of the lesser-known stories from Lawrence's past. Many of you know Dennis, and if you didn't already know him, you probably met him this evening. He is an internationally recognized scholar in the history of American architecture, and emeritus professor at the University of Kansas, and an editor of both volumes of Embattled Lawrence. Just so folks are aware, this event is being recorded and will be available on the library's YouTube page within a few days. And with that, I will turn it over to Dennis.
Thank you. Thank you. It's always a privilege to come to the library this way because normally I'm just checking out books, but now you're checking me out, right? And I'll try to do the best I can for an old guy. But Lawrence is a fabulous city. It has a great history. Most of its history, however, has never been published. More has been left out than left in. And one of my purposes in this series is to remove some of the left out and put it into the left in. Because I don't like to hit the same nail on the head over and over again. You will never hear me talk about Quantrill's Raid because plenty of people know a lot more about Quantrill's Raid than I care to know. But I've read everything I guess I should. So I'm going to be talking about a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Griffin, A.J. and Mary Griffin, who were two of the most important builders in the city of Lawrence. This will be in an article that will come out in Volume 3 called Building the City. And A.J. really built the city physically and also politically, and Mary built the city spiritually, institutionally, and she was a great community activist and very smart. You can see she's an intellectual, and that's what she was. Her favorite photo is got the book in her hand. And so Lawrence is full of people like this. These two came almost by surprise. They came in 1867 by covered wagon with his mother and his brother, Marcus, his mother Anne, and his brother Edward was already here, or had been here, would be here, and probably talked about Lawrence through letters to them. Lawrence, of course, is one of the most famous cities of the period because of Quantrill's Raid and because it was a so-called free state, an abolitionist city. And it was well known in Harper's Bazaar and written about even in London, particularly when in those 1860 period before the Civil War. We don't know, almost nobody knows anything about A.J. Griffin. He was a doer, not a sayer. That was in his obituary. His wife was very much a doer, but also a sayer. But they came in 1867 in a covered wagon. They came to a city that was growing at the rate of 400% from 1860 to 1870. This city grew 400%. They didn't have very much money. In fact, I don't know if they had any, so to speak. But they were smart, they were young, they were strong, they were enterprising, and they could see advantages to coming to a place like this as young people because there weren't that many advantages in Illinois and Ohio at that time. Whereas this was a brand new place opening up and bound to provide plenty of opportunity. So you can see that A.J. and Mary stuck it out in Lawrence until he died in 1907. She died in California in 1922. But they're a fabulous group. A.J., like his brothers, was a Civil War hero. You can see he has his badge of the American Army of the Republic, which he proudly wore. He and his three brothers all enlisted in the 35th Ohio Cavalry, and their enlistment ran out in 1864, and they all re-upped, right? They could have gone home and have been free, but they re-upped. And that unit was a logistics unit. A.J. was nearly the perfect soldier. He was considered to be very gracious, very considerate, always dressed perfectly in uniform. And where did that get him? Command headquarters. He basically was an aide to a general. But that didn't mean that he wasn't involved in the war, because they were in logistics and they were carrying supplies and ammunition to the front. And so A.J. learned a lot about logistics, and logistics was his middle name when he came to Lawrence and lived here from 1867 to 1907. So he came and he looked around and he said, wow, what they need is somebody to convey commodities, basic materials that are important for building a city. He was right on top of it. Now, his wife was also right on top of it. They got married in 1866. He was 25, she was 20. She was a Quaker. She married a non-Quaker. She was shunned. She lost her family when she was 12. But she was courageous. She was intelligent. She was a very social person. And she bore 4 children with him. Mariana in 1869. Charles in 1872. Let me see if I can remember her name. Sometimes I can and sometimes I can't. Edith was born in 1883, and Eleanor was born in 1879. So they had 4 children just like that. That means that they had to have resources in order to take care of them. And they didn't begin with very many resources. But here they were in probably the best place for young people to go, growing fast. They were young and they were ready to work, and they worked hard. They worked hard. A.J., just like his wife, was very engaged in the community. He had 10 terms on the city commission, the city council, elected from 3 different districts. We're talking about redistricting here. And so he was very engaged. And his wife was also extremely engaged. I'm going to give you the list at the end of the lecture, how many organizations she belonged to. But she was an expert in Japan, Japanese literature, Japanese architecture, Japanese art. And she was also very knowledgeable of French literature. She gave talks about French literature, probably about Flaubert or somebody like that, Madame Bovary, or the other French authors at that time. So they were not just to themselves. They were not just making money for themselves. They were making big contributions to the development of the city. And you know what? Neither one of them were mentioned even once in David Derry's History of Lawrence. Not even once. Probably the most important, really physical builder of Lawrence was not mentioned. That's because A.J. and Mary were shadow figures. They were in the shadow of people who were much more important to them, much more important to Lawrence, it seemed, like J.D. Bowersock, who was one of A.J. Griffin's closest colleagues. And J.D. Bowersock depended on A.J. Griffin. I'll explain that later. But he was overshadowed by this huge tree of a man. And there are other people like that. Elizabeth Watkins, for example, was a shadow figure to J.B. Watkins. She actually was basically running the business for him while he was in New York or London. And she ran the London office for a long time. She just started at age 17 with him. After he died, she took care of it all. So we have lots of people like this who are not well known, but that gives me a chance to bring them to the attention of the public, and through the books that are coming out to people, to the readers. Now, this volume, volume 3, called Building the City, will come out sometime next year. Just to alert you, we are working simultaneously now on the second edition of volume 1, Conflict and Community, because it's been out of print for so long, and when people bought volume 2, they said, well, where's volume 1? Well, I've finally been pushed to do volume 1 at the same time as volume 3, and I hope I make it. I think I will. I'm only 80, so I have a long way to go. Now, when A.J. and Mary got here, they lived in North Lawrence. We don't exactly know where they lived in North Lawrence, at least in the beginning. But we know that from 1867 to 1869, A.J. carried goods to southeast Kansas for Ridenhour and Baker, one of the most famous provisions business in Lawrence. And Ridenhour and Baker will stay in Lawrence until finally they moved to Kansas City. But he was going to southeast Kansas, let's say to Coffeyville. How long does it take you to get to Coffeyville when you have 2 oxen in front of you? Maybe you have workhorses in front of you, you're carrying a full load. It'll take you 4 or 5 days maybe to get there over very rough terrain. There weren't that many roads, you know, military roads basically. And then he had to turn around and come back. Empty. It's usually empty. So he did that for 2 years while surveying what was really needed in Lawrence. And in 1869, he began, first I wanted to, I never know exactly what I've done, yet I wanted to show you where he lived in 1869. Because this still exists, this house still exists on 526 Lincoln in North Lawrence. And his brother Marcus was a carpenter. And 1869, Mariana was born. So every time a child is born in their lives, they seemingly move to another house or another place, or every time he builds a business, they move to another place. But this little house, you can tell, is a very old house because it has so many additions. And it's on the record from 1869 on. And you would think that with so many floods, it would have been flooded out, but miraculously, no. And there were other miracles that happened to A.J. Griffin, particularly with his ice companies and floods, that didn't happen. So we surmise that while A.J. was going to work, his brother was building the house, because they bought these 4 lots in 1869. There was nothing on them. It cost them $187.50 for the 4 lots. In 1871, their first move, they sold this house and the 4 lots for $2,288. Now that tells you something about A.J. He realized that there was a tremendous economy besides what he was going to do as a worker. There was a tremendous economy in buying and selling land and property. And he did that all the way through his life. I followed about, I think it was Monica Davis, who's right back here, who's the photography co-editor of Volume 3 and also working on Volume 1, she gave me a list of properties that A.J. bought and sold. It went on and on and on and on. We're not even sure we got all of them. But you can see that he knew how to make money. And he made money, and they made money all their lives and became leaders in the city. But this little place is where they started in 1869 with his mother and his brother and his new wife. Here are the 4 generations then that we had. This is probably about 1895. There's A.J., obviously, right here. A.J. There's his mother, Tabitha, known as Anne. His first daughter, Mariana, who died at age 30 in 1899, and Luella, their daughter. So I'm just trying to show you that he not only made money, but he also made a big family. And many things happened to that family that cut it short. But nevertheless, A.J. was at work, and the first thing he noticed was that there wasn't very much lumber because much of the lumber had been cut down along the rivers, and that there would need to be stone quarries that he could load, he could marshal, load, and deliver to builders in that time. And so he started, once he sold his place in 1871, he bought a house from Martha Robinson, who was the sister of Charles Robinson, the first governor. And that was up on Oread. You know where the Oread Hotel is? That avenue that goes from the Oread Hotel to the university. We'll see some of that tonight. But he bought that house right up there because he knew there was a lot of limestone in them there hills, so to speak. And so he started his business, and he had 2 limestone quarries up there, one just north of the campus and one a little farther out west. And the same thing was true for his kilns, because you needed to have kilns in order to make mortar to put bricks and stone together. And so that's what he did. And it was extremely successful. He was really on this side of town over here, and I think that is still Old North College there. But this is just one of the quarries. We don't think that was his because unless it could have been, we don't know. But you can see that this is where Carruth O'Leary is today, right here. And if you look right behind Carruth O'Leary, you'll see 2 big parking lots. They go down below Carruth O'Leary and they go down like that. That's what this quarry is. That's what this quarry is. There's Marvin Hall. And there's the Natural History Museum. And I think that's Old North College. So Mount Oread was full of stone and could be used for people who were enterprising enough and could figure out how to do it. Yeah? And so this is what he did. And he had some, 1872, I keep up with several sides of the story. In 1872, when he moved his family up to the Oread Avenue, he had his first son, Charles. Charles, following his mother's direction, went to KU, went to Harvard, graduated from Harvard, became a professor of economics in Japan. That's where she got her interest, and drowned. And in 1904. So his life was cut short, just like his older sister's life. The other 2 girls, one of them married and lived a normal life, whatever that might have meant. And the youngest was a school teacher and died in 1966 here in Lawrence. So Charles was quite famous, and his son taught at Vassar and was a Latin American specialist. So the ripple effect from the mother was great, and of course they all learned to work hard too, and Charles did. But tragedy, it happens. Now, this is J.D. Bowersock. This was one of A.J.'s first big hits, and that was that the dam kept breaking, blown away by winter ice or by floods in the spring or the summer. It just kept going away. And what did Mr. Bowersock need in order to repair that dam? A lot of limestone, gigantic pieces of limestone. So in 1877, he got this contract with J.D. Bowersock, who didn't at that time know him, but knew of him. He had been here 10 years. And from 1877 to 1881, he hauled hundreds of wagons down the hill from Mount Oread to rebuild that dam. And that was really important to him. That was a big step forward for him. And you can see this is what he was doing. The dam is 17 feet high, 655 feet wide. On the third of it, on the south side, it's on a limestone base. The other 2/3 is on sand. Well, no wonder it was blown out all the time. No wonder. And it was on sand, and it was built in a crib like that. So that was a timber crib filled with rock. And now it's covered with concrete, but at that time it wasn't covered with concrete, but it was filled with rock. And so when the water came over the dam, what happens right after it comes like down here, it digs in like this. You know, after every waterfall, it digs in like this, and before you know it, it was washed out. So here's A.J. Griffin hauling. He in 1881, he had brought down 2,000 cords of stone. That's about 2 million pounds of stone. And in 1881, he was still bringing off the mountain with 25 wagons. He was still working. Sometimes he was hiring as many as 35 wagons to bring the stone down. And so he was still doing. Well, it worked for a while, but you know the dam kept going out. It kept going out primarily because of that. And it's still there. There's still cribs, but now that it's covered in concrete, it doesn't go out as often. But it does have to be maintained and worked on every once in a while. So this was a big step forward for A.J. He made quite a bit of money there from 1877 to 1881. But he was using his logistics knowledge that he got while being a wonderful soldier. This bridge went across in 1870. This was the Kansas Pacific. And he began to haul stone for the Kansas Pacific in 1878. That was another big contract, right? Here he is now. This is the Oread, the avenue that we know, and right down here somewhere is the famous Oread Hotel of today. And right up here is the museum, and right there is the house that he had built for him in 1879. He was already moved up here. He lived in the house that he bought from Martha Robinson. And then in 1879, another daughter came. So every time he got a new child, he needed a bigger house. And he just had enough money, and he had a courageous wife, and they just built and built and built. So you can see that This is on the west, whoop, I don't know what happened there, didn't mean to do it. This is on the west side overlooking the Oread Valley there. And there used to be a water tower up there. Is there still a water tower? It's not a tall tower. They took it down, didn't they? It was a big tub-like. There's still one there? Yeah, I think it is. So that was really important for Lawrence's water, of course, which was a disaster. And I'll talk about that next week when I talk about the sewers, because all sewers are water, right? And so this is kind of what it looked like when he was hauling an awful lot of stone everywhere. And in 1880, he hauled all the stone for the Pearson Mills. In 1881, he macadamized all the street from 9th to 10th. In 1882, he hauled all the stone for the Wilder Brothers shirt factory, which we still have, is being renovated. Okay, right now. He hauled it all. And in 1883, William Cutler, in his History of Kansas, said about A.J. Griffin, he didn't forget A.J. Griffin, that A.J. Griffin was responsible for hauling 3/4 of the building material to the Lawrence downtown by 1883. 3/4. So if you go out there tonight and go to one of those businesses along Massachusetts and you look over there and there's a stone wall, you're looking at A.J. Griffin, probably. So here's a guy who, how could you get a more important person in building the city than that? Of course you could get J.D. Bowersock, who had the money and the bank. By the way, A.J. Griffin was a member of the board of the Lawrence National Bank, which was at 7th and Massachusetts, and that was Bowersock's bank. Bowersock knew when somebody was good and knew that this guy would succeed in everything he did, which was true, A.J. And so that was just a good example of two people getting together, one with the money and one with the know-how, but one who got money with know-how and supported the guy who had money. So that's the way it works, right? That's the way it works. Now, A.J. was very smart about business, and he said, what can I do beyond stone that would make use of my logistics capability? He started a retail coal company because people needed coal to heat their houses. And in 1881, he started a retail coal company, and his first yard was down by the Methodist Church on Massachusetts Street, and it's at 10009 Massachusetts. That's where the first coal yard was. And in 1883, Mr. Palmer got together with Mr. Griffin, and they built a larger company. They would get a second yard. But it only lasted 2 years, and then the partnership dissolved. I'm sure it's because Mr. Palmer was from Manhattan. And if you're going to work with somebody in Manhattan, you better watch your back, right? I come from a K-State family, so I'm only teasing. But it didn't last very long. But this coal company lasted until 1915. It lasted longer than the stone company, which went to 1893, or the ice company that went to 1910. And remember, A.J. Griffin died in 1907, but his companies outlasted him quite a while. And this was a very, very important business, because, particularly to students, because, first of all, Griffin had great integrity. just like they recognized when he was in the military. He never cheated on his weights. He had reliable service. He had free delivery. And when his competitors ran out of coal, he would sell them coal. That was the kind of man he was. And so the students really liked this guy, as everybody else did, because of his personality. He was very conscientious, and he was very considerate, and he was always on time. And if they didn't have the money, he figured out how to get them the coal until they did have the money. And you know students, they run out of money, right? And you couldn't call mom and dad or email them or text them and say, send me more. So the coal company was really important. The coal shafts, where you see in Osage and Scranton, also in Burlingame, were the coal shafts. All lumps, no dirt. And that was true for him. I mean, you didn't know what you were going to get often when you got a load of coal. But he didn't do that. And he was also selling wood. So that however you were heating, he was available, and he knew how to deliver it. It was a retail company, so he delivered it to people's houses. And he built on his experience in logistics. He kept his stone business going, but now he's got a coal business. And in 1883, he sets up his second yard. And this was right here, the National Bank of Lawrence, right there. That's still there, but you can't see it the way it used to be. I'm going to show it to you. And here's A.J. Griffin's second coal yard. And he moved from Oread down here because he liked to live close to his business. And so when he was selling stone primarily, he lived up there on the rock, right? And when he started selling coal, and he had now 2 yards to keep it going, he moved down right downtown. And here you can see that he sold at 2 different places. 107 Mass, I got that off by 2, I thought it was 109, 107 Mass, and 16 East Winthrop. Now he would also build another coal yard because in 1888 he got a big contract with the Lawrence School District to deliver coal to all the schools. And that contract ran till 1915. So he got all the big contracts because he was such a solid person, so reliable. People wanted to work with him. They enjoyed it. They never worried about being cheated. No lumps and no dirt. And also, he was very interested in helping others who weren't as fortunate as he and his family. He was always like that, giving to people. So he set up this coupon system, a coal ticket, that for every 100 of them that people brought and received, he would give a 1 ton of coal to the poor. He didn't have to do that. He did have to do it. That was who he was. He had to do it. And so $3 per ton from Leavenworth, Scranton, Excello, and this is what really made him a lot of money, helping the poor. Great advertisement. Now, this is the National Bank of Lawrence. I think this is a Model T. And Model Ts were built from 1903 to 1927. I think this was J.D. Bowersock's Model T, parked in front of his bank. I just make that up for you as part of the story. But when I look at that, I think, well, he's the only one parked there. There's nobody out there. It must be early in the morning, and J.D. Bowersock got to work early, and he rode a Model T. Well, right here, is A.J. and Mrs. Griffin's second coal yard, and they moved into this little house. The reason I have this is because of Monica Davis, my photo co-editor, who can find almost anything that I can't find, because she helped me get this very thing. So I love to see these kinds of photos, or paintings really. It's probably a photo then painted, because you find things that really people were just looking at the big bank. They weren't caring about this. But this is a good example. Here's the big guy who overshadows the little guy. But this little guy is so significant in the history of Lawrence that if you forget him, you don't really understand how it was built. So this is a great view of the shadow figure in buildings. And it was at this time, approximately at this time, that he established the Home River Coal Company in North Lawrence. So he had 3 yards, and he had yards on all of the railroad lines. And by the late 1880s, 1890s, he was delivering to Lawrence, was brought in by railroad, say in December, sometimes 100 cars would come. Sometimes in October, 110 cars would come. And that's just how much he was delivering to the city through his coal yards and to the people of Lawrence. Take care. Okay, come back after your phone call. So this business was very, very good. And he was following one of his principles. You build on what you know. You know your business. You know your people who are your customers. And you build on it. And what he was doing was building on the basic idea that logistics would always be important no matter who was living at what time. And at his time, he really was the top dog, yet he wasn't mentioned by David Derry. Now he builds on another very necessary commodity, ice. Can you imagine not having a refrigerator? Can you imagine just having an ice box that delivered? Well, this was big business on Lawrence, ice manufacturing, because we had that big pool behind the dam, sort of called the Lawrence Pond, Lawrence Lake. And from the very beginning, people who came to Lawrence from Boston knew that we would need ice here. Boston was the home of Frederick Tudor. Frederick Tudor was called the Ice King of the East Coast. And he really ran the ice business out of Boston. That's where a lot of the early settlers from Lawrence came from Boston. So they were very used to having ice and icebox. And they weren't going to be able to live very long here comfortably if they didn't have that. Well, Lawrence was one of the few cities in Kansas that actually could harvest ice because of its dam. The problem with ice when you harvest it in a river like Lawrence is that, one, it depends on the weather. If you don't have a good cold winter, you can't harvest ice. Even if you do have a good cold winter, what's the ice going to look like? Toxic. You know, I'm going back to Topeka and Manhattan. They flush their stools and it comes down here. We harvest the ice and it's not great. It's not great. But nevertheless, there were ice people from the very beginning. 1855, John Mack came from Boston. He was the first ice dealer. There was another ice dealer in 1856. His last name I can't remember. His first name I can, Reuben. And then Ida Miller set up a big ice company, and he practically controlled all the ice in town by 1879. Then there was Julius Fisher. He started in 1868. And this is what it looked like there, north, or just to the west of the pond, of the dam. This is what was happening. This is not really what it looked like, but basically this is how they did it. They harvested the ice. And some years it could be 11 inches thick and clear as a bell, and some years it could be 1 inch thick and you couldn't get it. So what were you going to do when you couldn't get ice? That was the problem with ice in the river, that it was dirty. Very seldom was it clean. And you also ran out by July. There was no ice left. But what they did, and you can see that right here, and we had them. These are ice houses. And that's where they stored the ice. And they stored the ice in sawdust. And they would store it in sawdust, store it in sawdust, store it. And then they would deliver it, and it lasted until there wasn't any left. So from July the 1st to January the 1st, there's no ice. That made a huge difference. Now, that's exactly how it was working. They were out there sawing these big chunks of ice. And the other problem with this is it required a lot of labor. And every year you had to come up with 300 or 400 men who would work for 6 weeks or 8 weeks out there on the ice. And could you get that many when you needed them? Well, generally you could. And so they were out here on the ice sawing it. And then the ice was so big, 200-pound blocks of ice that had to be stored in those ice houses, they had to use horses to move that ice from the river to the bank. And then there were various ways of getting the ice up into the ice houses, and it's stored pretty high. So it was a tremendous, laborious experience for everybody. And it didn't last all that long. Now, Julius Fisher in 1868, wholesale ice, supplies, private families delivered at the door. That's what they did. That's all he did. And if this business didn't work for him, he didn't work, right? That's not the way AJ did business. The next one was Ida Miller, who was like the Ice King here. Again, ice buildings near the Lawrence Dam. He's got an office at 701 Massachusetts. Already got telephones, very important to have telephones, and shipments from water, winter especially. Yes, winter only was the specialty. And wholesale and retail. And there were a number of other ice people like Woodruff, the Waldorfs, you know, the big beer hall. It had to have a lot of ice to take care of the beer. There was the Armour, all the beef companies that were hauling beef, they had to have ice for their refrigerated cars. Fruits and vegetables were very important to be kept iced down. So there was a lot of business. And not only was there a lot of business right here, but since Lawrence was one of the few cities that had an ice business possible, they were shipping out a huge amount of ice by railroad car to Kansas City. And they were shipping it to Topeka too. So ice was fine as long as the weather was cold and as long as you could take the turds in the water that were frozen in the ice, and as long as you could do that, you were okay. But if you look at this, here's where the ice pond was. You can see here are Ida Millers. I showed you the earlier ice houses. There are ice houses right there. There was so much ice being manufactured that there are ice houses all up and down the north side of that pond and up and down the south side of that pond. So it was a big, and that's Waldorf, the beer brewery right there. So they had to, cook it too, but they had to ice it down. So in 1891, Mr. Ida Miller dies. That was an opportunity for A.J. Griffin because he was going to have a huge, huge industry here with hardly anybody to run it who had the know-how to do it. He was going to not run it eventually, he was going to buy it. And he started in 1891 a retail business based on the work that he had done for the coal and wood business. He just had people add ice to the delivery systems. So he already had all the customers there. And he said, okay, I'm going to start delivering ice too. All you have to do is get an ice box. That's all they had to do. 1891. And from 1893 to about 1900, A.J. Griffin bought up all the ice houses. And one of the things that really helped him do that is the Polar Ice Company out of Kansas City had an ice business here, and they had ice houses here. And in 1893, they put up all this ice, and the Polar Ice Company shipped almost all of it to Kansas City. And then they filled up the ice houses too. The problem was that the men didn't get paid. They began to believe that they were going to just abscond with the ice and stiff them. And there was a huge uproar in the city, 300 men and their families, it was crazy. And it was said that the ice that these men put up on those ice houses was not put up very well, so it wasn't worth anything. A.J. Griffin knew better. He inspected that ice, and it was good. And so he bought out the Polar Ice Company and paid all the men. How to get into a business with a splash. I mean, another heroic thing that he did for the city. And so by 1895, he had almost all the ice under his control. But the thing that he didn't have under his control was the weather. And the sickening ice that was in your Kool-Aid or your iced tea or whatever it was in your icebox. Well, there was an answer to that too. Here he starts his ice company in 1891. He's just carrying a little bit of ice around. He's not even gotten started. He's buying ice from all the ice people. Well, what happened? It happened in Germany. Carl von Linde discovered the refrigeration process in 1872. And by 1878, he had a patent on the first refrigerators. And who knew about that? A.J. Griffin knew about that, but Mary Griffin, who was a world traveler in Europe, knew about it too. And so in 1894, what happens? A.J. Griffin builds the first synthetic ice house in town. And all the old timers who said, oh, it'll never work, it'll never be good, that was the end of them. Because he could deliver the ice 12 months out of the year. And it was clean. And who wanted to buy the ice on the river anymore? If you could get clean ice in January, February, June, and July, you know, all of those months were available to you. And so here again was A.J. Griffin figuring it out before other people did. And so he built, based on this engineer, Bavarian engineer, based on his discovery and his patent, he built a synthetic ice process. So you needed a boiler, you needed to be a way to freeze it, and then you needed a way to store it. And that was fairly simple. And so this is the first ice factory. 1894. And it was so good that guess who came in? It was a 7.5-ton ice machine. That is, every day it could create 7.5 tons of ice. Well, by the 1896 or so, he was creating 9 tons of ice with that little thing. And who understood that very well? J.D. Bowersock. And A.J. Griffin was on Bowersock's board. And he said, hey, let's build a bigger ice factory. So in 1897, they put in a 9-ton ice factory. And by the time, the turn of the century, the business was so good that A.J. Griffin was supplying it to other cities and building synthetic ice factories in other places, like Iola. Iola was really good because it had very cheap fuel. It had gas. It had oil. And that was cheaper than hauling coal up and filling those boilers with coal and boiling that water. See, the water is boiled and it comes back and it precipitates out of the steam and it's clean. That was the simple process. One of the problems was, where are you going to store all that stuff? So they had to build ice storage buildings. And the last one went down in, I think it was when they tore down the elevators and built the city hall. That was one of the last ice buildings that was still there from that period. So they made so much money, and it was so much cheaper that A.J. said, you know what? I think we're just going to close down our ice factories here in Lawrence because we can do it more cheaply in Iola and just have it shipped in. He never did it, though. He never did it, but he knew that was the thing that could make it work. So Bowersock gets in on it. And again, Bowersock owns about half of the business. And guess who was, as far as I can tell, the first woman full director of any business in town? Mary. Mary was a director of that ice company in 1897 when it was finished. And she sold her portion of it in 1910 after he died. But J.D. knew a good thing when he saw it. He was reliable and he knew he would be successful. So you got your coupon, right? And here's 1,000 pounds, number 1497, and you have to keep the coupon. I'm not quite sure how this happened, but I think that they ordered it by phone. So here's the telephone, 88. And the wagon would come along and they'd say 50 pounds and they would write 50 pounds in there and they kept it in their coupon until they got up to 1,000 pounds and they had to get another coupon. Now that's how I perceive it. That may not be how it worked. If anybody out there has insight into how that may have actually worked, please speak up. But that's how I think it worked.
What numbered street is Winthrop now?
That's 7th.
7th.
Yeah. So it was right. 12 West Winthrop is not quite as far west as his coal yard, which was also going. So he had a nice office. He had a coal yard. Maybe he actually had him in the same office. That would make sense if it would work. So that's how he delivered it. Now, does anyone think that I haven't touched upon a great builder in Lawrence? I think you can see that without him, who would do it? It takes more than money to build a city. It takes more than brains to build a city that can create money. It takes somebody who can actually do the work and who can superintend that many men and can run 3 businesses at once and still have a family life. And 10 terms on the city commission, too. 10 terms. If we just look at Griffin, there's so many things here, and I'm the same thing with his wife. Just to go back and let you know how many, during the Civil War, how many battles he was in. Mill Springs, Perryville, Stone River, Tahula, Chickamauga, Mission Ridge, the Atlantic Campaign. He went through a lot. Well, when A.J. was elected, that was the time when, if you were elected as an alderman, you actually had responsibilities beyond just talking on Tuesday night. You actually were assigned certain committees that you were responsible for to make it happen. In other words, if you were assigned the sewer committee, which would have been one of the most difficult ones, you actually had to run that sewer department. And during A.J.'s time, he was on these committees: Lawrence and Ordnance, Library, Board of Health, Claims and Accounts, Water, Gas and Electric, Sewer, Fire Department, Police and License, City Property, Public Works, Streets and Alleys and Bridges. What else was there? He was responsible for that. Not one mention in David Derry's history book, though. Not one mention. Not one mention. Now, also, Mary, she was this intellectual. She gave lectures on all these different topics. She was very important in the women's suffrage movement, and she was a community activist superior. I wrote down all of the clubs that she was a part of and which she operated in her life in the city. Lawrence Improvement Association, Unity Club, University Extension Service, Ingleside, Quivira, City Federation, Women's Club, Women's Equal Suffrage Association, Douglas County Equal Franchise League. What else did she do? But reach out to the city and bring the city together in socially organized, cooperative ways to help build the city. Because you don't build buildings, you don't build streets, you don't build sewers for nobody. You build them for people. And as Winston Churchill said, first we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. And that's true. That's an axiomatic truth. And these people were really responsible for it. And look where they got. They started out in this little tiny house that they had to build in 1867, and they ended up in the most glorious Queen Anne house at the end of Connecticut Street that Barry and Robin live in and taken good care of, and they're working on it today. Today. Here is another example of buildings showing you what happens when you come without any money, but you're young, you work hard, you're enterprising, you're smart, you can see what's needed. And they built that house in 1901. This house was built in 1869. So in a little over 30 years, this is what happened. And this wasn't because they were taking all the money for themselves and weren't spreading it around. No. The reason this probably happened, in addition to being smart, is because they were very oriented towards their community. Like almost nobody else. Like almost nobody else. And so I found it fascinating to work on this project with Barry and Robin, and was in that house many times. It's a gorgeous place. A gorgeous woman, an intellectual. Look what she did. With 4 children, she became one of the leading intellectuals in town, plus a social activist. And she always, I could tell just by my work and my research, I could tell that this pair worked just like that together. there were many pairs that came as pioneers. I doubt that there was a better team than this team. And I'm so happy that you now know about them. Thank you. Don't you like that?
Is that the courthouse there?
That's the courthouse there. That was done in 1911. I think that's the courthouse there. I don't know what our stone building it would be, but that was after he died. Well, if you have any questions, I don't know that I can answer them, but I'd be glad to try.
What was his first and middle name?
Andrew Jackson.
You didn't make that up.
Andrew Jackson Downing. And her middle name was Carroll, Mary Carroll Griffin. I said Downing. That's wrong. Those are architects. Andrew Jackson Griffin. Yes. And Mary Carroll Griffin. Carroll was her maiden name, and she took that as her middle name. So they were married in 1866, and she was thrown out. What a courageous young woman at 20. She'd get in a covered wagon. She just got married, and she would go someplace she had never gone before. Out in Lawrence in the West.
Yeah.
She was the right woman for him. Yes, sir.
Where did the coal come from and how did it get to the coal yards?
Well, it came from Osage County, Burlingame,
We had
and
coal available in Kansas.
yes, we did. It wasn't great coal, but it was good enough, and it came by train. And he had his yards near train tracks, and so it was unloaded. And then he would carry it. He would carry it to your house, and you would order it in October. He had like 100 coal trains in October that came into Lawrence. He would then unload it, go around and unload at your house so you'd stay warm. And maybe a little bit of wood too to help get it started, right?
On one of your maps, at the very bottom, it said Kansas State University.
That's what the KU used to be called.
Oh, was that 1864?
1865 when it was established, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was called Kansas State University.
So
And-
did they steal our name?
I always forget that. It was sometime in the 1860s, I'm pretty sure. So then it became the University of Kansas and Kansas State College. And then eventually it became Kansas State University. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, KT?
Two questions. Were the Polar Ice Company people in Kansas City related to the Polars here? And the other thing is, what was their ethnic background? Where did their families immigrate from?
The first question I can't answer, I don't know. AJ was born in Virginia, so he was born at the South. And I assume that Griffin is probably a Scotch name, wouldn't you think? So they were probably Scotch-Irish. They could have come in the 18th century. A lot of them did and filled up Virginia. And they left Virginia when he and his brothers were fairly young and moved to Ohio. And then he married Mary Carroll in Illinois and came. So I'm just guessing that's right. But I haven't done that research to find out where that family came from. But he was born in Virginia, and I presume that she was born in Illinois. Ohio.
Where was she educated? Mary educated?
What?
Where was Mary educated?
She was self-educated.
Oh, well then the other question is, the ice company that used to be at Sixth, Vermont?
Yeah,
Is that his ice place?
yeah, 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 that was.
Everything but ice, yeah.
Everything but ice.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
Barry.
Yeah, another person that probably was not in Gary's book, I don't know.
You weren't. You were not in Derry's book.
That's true, that's not who I'm talking about.
Oh, okay. I thought you were talking about yourself.
Alexander Shaw, can you talk
Oh,
about
Alexander Shaw.
your relationship with him?
Alexander Shaw built that house for him. And I think he probably built your house. Alexander Shaw had a lumber company at 7th and Vermont, kind of right the corner where the library is. And one of the things he did build, we know that for sure, he built this house right there for AJ and Mary. Yeah.
Is that house still there?
No. Right there, put in a parking lot, right? So it's a parking lot now. And of course, Old North College was destroyed in 1919, I believe, with a Whippet tank out of World War I. Did you know that? They just rolled over it. They didn't shoot at it, they just crashed it down. And Monica found some nice photos of that Whippet going after Old North College.
Just a general research question. How do you come up with all these photos related to this specific topic? Just go digging like at the Watkins or the
Digging
research library on campus?
both of them. Watkins is very important. The Spencer Research Library is very important, and the Kansas State Historical Society is very important. And then, of course, we do have photos from personal collections once in a while. But if you want to know how to find it all, you just talk to Monica Davis right back there with a big grin. And so I am so lucky because she knows the archives, she knows the photography collections. She worked at the Watkins Museum for 15 years, I don't know, 10 years. And so she just happened to be available, and I happened to know her because I had worked on this and other projects with her. And so I was very lucky that she was willing to sacrifice a lot of time on this effort. Sir, I'll get back to you.
Oh, this is off kind of the subject, but I'm so happy that you're redoing your first volume. And so is it going along more quickly than the third now? Are we going to be
Yes.
able to see it?
Yes, you're going to get it. You're going to get it before you get the third. We had hoped that we would be able to get it out in December, but you know, these books take longer and more complicated, and we have to argue about them, and we also didn't just reprint it because we could make a lot of improvements. That's why it's a second edition. We put in a lot more photos, which meant that Monica was out there searching for a lot of things. It needed to be redesigned. We put a new cover on it, new paper, so it will fit in. It's about the same size as volume 2, and it's the same, you know, thickness and same size, so eventually there'll be 4 volumes. So we meet, I work on it practically every day. I know that Monica does, but we can only do so much. And life does intervene, you know. It can do that. Thank you for coming, sir. Oh, I got time for however many you have.
First of all, I'm a newbie. I've only been here for 4.5 years. So this may be a really naive question, but it seems to me that there's an elephant in the room that maybe everybody else knows that I don't know. So what's your theory about why we're not in the book?
Why this is not in the book? Because there were,
The whole story.
yeah, because there were so many really important figures that were obvious that they had to cover them, maybe money. They had to cover them. And also, this David Derry's book and and earlier books were general histories. So they could only do so much, and then they'd go on, and had to go on and go on. Whereas my books, our books, are deep dives into subjects. And we're just looking for something that nobody has found yet that's important. So I think the historian just had a job to do. He did a very good job. In his introduction, David Derry now, he said, look, I've only just scratched the surface. It's important for the next generation to carry on the history of Lawrence. And after these 4 books are done, I can guarantee you that we've only just scratched the surface. And that the next generation will also have to do its duty, just like we are doing our duty now, and the next generation after that, because there will always be history to be told. But if you don't write it, it's just the past. It's not history. It's easy to forget. Most of us, certainly I, will be forgotten. And so it's easy to forget, it's hard to remember, and it's hard to find people crazy enough like me to do it. Because that's about what I do in my life right now. And I have plenty of other things to do, but I think it's so important to get this down, because here I am and I'm willing to do it. The other thing that's so important, and I think we should not be underestimated, is the significance of newspapers. Before we had search engines with computers, nobody could go through the 7 or 8 newspapers that were going on in Lawrence at one time. It was just impossible. If you tried to work on this, first of all, you'd miss a lot. Secondly, by the time you got it done, you'd be too exhausted to write anything. Now, we were lucky. We had newspapers. And the Simons family started in 1891 and stopped in 2016. He took a lot of criticism. But look at the journal world today compared to the journal world under the Simons family. We won't have a history to write after 2016 because there are no newspapers that are covering everything. But Simons had a full photography department, and he had a very large reporter department, and they were going out, covering the East Lawrence Neighborhood Association, the school districts, everything that was going on. If you just look at those newspapers, you can criticize Dolph Simons Jr. and Dolph Sr. and WC all you want. Fine. Never was a braver man than Dolph Simons to write that Saturday column for people to criticize. Here he was, a Republican in a Democratic town. So, he did a lot of great work. But he told me in my interview with him, by the way, there'll be an article about him and his family as being catalysts for the building of the city. I asked him if he would write an article for them, Volume 3, and he said, I'm not a good writer. And I said, well, okay, well, I'll do an interview, and then we'll see what happens with the interview. And I think in the end, I'm going to be writing it off the interview and then put his name on it. Because this project is a project that is not a single voice. Here's another problem. If you only had one voice writing, as you have in most histories, you have one perspective. So this one person is just going to see parts of it. Now, this series is written through the help of many voices. People who really did things, but are not writers. And it's my job, our job, to find them, to find out what they know, to interview them, and sometimes write the article for them and put their name on it. Because the voices are important. Just one voice, just Dennis Domer, is not that interesting. But when you have all kinds of different people contributing, of course it's much harder, it takes longer. You sort of indicated that it's taking a long time. It is taking a long time, and that's because of it. Because I have to work with, like in the next volume, there are 40, 45 articles. I have to work with 45 authors. And I have a great team. I have a team of editors. I have photo editors. I've got designers. I've got people who raise funds. But it takes a lot of work, but I don't regret 1 minute of it. And I hope you will like it when it's done. You may not like everything, but I think that you'll see that the history of our city cannot be written easily by one person. And it can't be just about the tallest trees and leaving out all the other people who actually made it happen. So I'm looking for those people like AJ and Mary Carroll who made it happen. Yes?
I don't have a question, I have 2 comments.
Okay.
First of all, I wish there were more younger people here. But of course, that's our day and age, but they need to hear what you have to say. And the second thing is, if you did classes like you have done tonight, then you have taught history the way it should have been taught. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I did do classes that way. And the reason I'm interested in local history is because one of the subjects I taught was vernacular architecture, common buildings of common people. And so we take that for granted. But I grew up in a little tiny town, northeast Kansas. My dad had 3 farms, and I worked on those farms with him, and I knew what barns and corn cribs and everything else that had to do with common buildings. So I could bring something new to the university. And I always told my students I always taught at night, by the way, so that I could have a lot of different kinds of people studying it. I always said to them, when you get done with this course, you'll never be bored with Kansas again. And I had many parents who would come to me at graduation time, and they said, you know, you're right, we can't get across Kansas with Susie anymore because she has to stop at every elevator, every fence, every silo, every outhouse, whatever. So I knew that I'd really made a contribution. So that's why I got into local history. I also taught early American architecture and American architecture after 1865, which I enjoyed. But the vernacular one was the one that was closest to my heart because I grew up with those buildings. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, it's been an hour and a half.
Good deal.
Oh yes, I have one more person to introduce to you. My colleague and friend, Tom Harper,
Hey, all right.
who takes care of us because he finds the money to do this.
So, Dennis didn't ask me to be here. I put myself into this mix. I'm on the fundraising